Happy to welcome you here today. I'm Cathy Kezelman, President of Blue Knot, and together with me today I have Pam Stavropoulos, who's our Head of Research. Hi Pam, if you'd like to just introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah, sure, Cathy. Hello, everybody. My name's Pam Stavropoulos. I'm Head of Research with Blue Knot, have been for several years now, and I also have a small clinical practice of complex trauma clients.
Thanks, Pam, and great to have you today. Obviously, we've collaborated over many years. I think it's close to a decade.
I was thinking that coming up.
Yeah. And published, a number of documents, number of sets of guidelines, and it's quite an array now. And I thought it'd be really great to meet today to just talk about, the various guidelines, how they came about, and what their different roles are.
Sure.
So going back perhaps to the first set in 2012, if you'd like to just paint a picture of them.
Sure. And we were just saying before we hit record that the word guidelines is singular, and we can all fall into the trap of thinking it's just one set, but Blue Knot now has a number of guidelines, so it's very timely to clarify, even for ourselves when there's so much work with all the different sets. So it goes back to 2012, as you said, Cathy, which in some ways is a long time ago and in other ways not. But at that time, or prior to 2012, there actually weren't guidelines for complex trauma, which seems really strange now, because the American colleagues were very close to getting out their set, which are now there. But we actually got ours out first, which is quite interesting. And despite the fact that a lot of the work obviously is from American clinicians and researchers, the contribution of the guidelines that was recognised is that it brings together so many different approaches, the neuroscience, the attachment, the clinical side, trauma-informed. So those guidelines came out in 2012, and they were sent across to the ISSTD, which is the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, which is the sort of peak body for trauma and dissociation based in the US. And they got picked up very quickly and unanimously endorsed, and were invited to present them at the ISSTD conference of 2012. And they were launched in Parliament by the then Federal Minister for Mental Health, wasn't it? Yeah, and so really took off. And following that, just shortly after, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses for Child Sexual Abuse was announced. So it was a sort of convergence of circumstances that led to Blue Knot really starting to be known for the work that we've done, and when it was called ASCA, Adult Surviving Child Abuse, prior to 2012. So 2012 was really a milestone year for complex trauma, for Blue Knot. But time goes on, as Cathy said, several years later, a couple of years ago, maybe we should update them, and thought, well, I guess we should, because a lot has happened in the intervening time from 2012 to 2019, which was when the clinical guidelines came out at the end of last year.
So I suppose going back to those 2012 guidelines, if you'd just like to talk a little, because there were two sets of guidelines in those, and maybe just to talk to both sets, and then we'll get to the sort of the more updated guidelines soon. Yep.
Sure. Yeah. So at the time, it's made sense to have the two sets in the one publication. So we had the clinical set, that was the first set of guidelines in the 2012 publication. So very much for clinicians, for therapists, for mental health workers who, work directly in a clinical therapeutic sense with people who experience the impacts of complex trauma. So they're what we call the clinical guidelines. It's good to explain this because there is a bit of confusion sometimes. But we also released in the same publication in 2012 a second set of guidelines on organisational, and we call those the trauma-informed organisational guidelines, because trauma-informed actually relates more specifically to organisations rather than to clinical one-to-one work. That's what's a little bit confusing for people. And also because they were both released in the same publication, the clinical and the organisational in 2012, the organisational ones were a bit overshadowed. The clinical ones got picked up very quickly. And trauma-informed is developed too, but because it's a slightly different emphasis, and because there's just so much material now available in both clinical and non-clinical, we decided for the update in 2019 to release them as two separate publications, the updated ones. So the clinical ones have come out last year. The organisational ones will come out under separate cover pretty soon. We're just finalising those. But that's the big point of clarification for people, I guess, that clinical is about clinical treatment. Trauma-informed is really non-clinical. It's organisational. It's about how to treat people in a humane way so that all workers who work in mental health and other settings know how not to make things worse. It's not about being a clinician to be trauma.
And really trauma-informed applies to us all. So beyond organisations, it's really a way for human beings to treat one another regardless of roles and where they are.
Absolutely, and that's the key point, because we now know, of course, and the Royal Commission's very much established it, that trauma is so prevalent throughout society. So it's really important that people don't feel they can't say anything about trauma or can't, speak to somebody who's experienced trauma, think, I'm not a clinician, I don't know what to say. Of course, the clinical workers specialise. Of course, that's dealt with by clinicians. But chances are, given the prevalence of trauma that we all know, if we haven't experienced ourselves, someone in the family or a friend or someone, so we need to know broadly what the impacts of trauma are, how it affects people, and how to speak to people in a basic sense. If they've experienced trauma, which also leads to another point, Cathy. Of course, we've released separate publications on how to talk about trauma. So there's a lot to fill everybody in, but talking about trauma is another series. They're not really guidelines, but they're papers we've also released that are very important for the general public. We've got one paper on it. We've got one on mental health professionals. We've got, I think, one for GPs.
Yeah, one for primary care.
Yes, I don't want people to think it's just for clinicians. Trauma is a very broad issue. Yeah.
So let's just talk briefly about the Talking About Trauma series. How important is it to talk about trauma?
Oh, look, I think it's incredibly important. And I think everybody realises this now. Where the confusion is how do you do it? I think maybe prior to perhaps as recently as the Royal Commission, people thought, oh, maybe trauma and it's terrible. Maybe it's just a few people. Now we know it is incredibly prevalent, that it takes many different forms. So it's very important it's talked about. And I think people do know that, but how to do it in a sensitive way is the $60,000 question. We also know that even trained clinicians often don't screen for trauma. So even when people are trained, it can be hard to know how do we actually raise this. But because it's so prevalent, we do need to know. And it's not as difficult. I think the real thing is, as we're saying, the sort of phobia about how do I do it. But there are a few pointers and suggestions which we address in the paper about how to do it in a low-key, non-stressful way for the person we're talking to and for ourselves as well.
Because I think there's a misconception that people need to explore all the detail of what happened to them, all the graphic information, and can you just sort of talk to that a little bit, because I think obviously that can be quite re-traumatizing.
Absolutely, and that's the importance of knowing the basics, because it's not at all about going into detail. And it's really sad if something as simple as saying, look, I'm really sorry that's happened to you. Do you know the number of someone you can speak to about that if you need therapy or whatever? That's often all it takes. And people are so scared of upsetting that they say nothing. And it's that saying nothing that's so isolating that people feel that, I can't mention it to anyone, they'll get embarrassed. So really all it's required for the non-clinician, for the average person, if you become aware that someone's experienced trauma, it's simply acknowledging it, validating the person and having, the numbers to say the Blue Knot helpline or wherever to point people in the right direction if they need more support.
Even to say, I don't know what to say, but I'm here.
Absolutely.
What is it you feel you need? How can I help?
So hopefully that puts people's minds at rest a bit, because it'd be really sad if on the one level, public awareness is there, but another level don't quite know how to take it to the next step, which is feeling more comfortable to just respond in a humane way to somebody.
And knowing that there is help and support and that you can reach out for it. And certainly all of the guidelines are on the Blue Knot website and, can be downloaded for free or purchased in hard copy.
And just on that point about support, there's different types of support, aren't there? There's the clinical supporters for clinicians, absolutely. But support for ourselves and each other as human beings is a different type of support, and that's no less important. Very important.
That's right. And, it's a question of what's therapeutic, but we know there's therapeutic in the broad sense, and therapeutic is being there in relationship with one another, because we know that complex trauma occurs in relationship and therefore can be healed in relationship.
Complex trauma predates the existence of clinicians, that's for sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
So talking about complex trauma, you referred earlier to the 2019 clinical practice guidelines and the update. Why did they need to be updated? Because 2012 is not that far earlier than 2019.
Yeah, that was actually my initial response when you asked me about it. I thought, do they really need? And then when I looked into it, and it just shows how fast the pace is and how we absorb change very quickly. A number of things have changed since 2012. One is that there is now a diagnosis, a formal diagnosis of complex PTSD. Now, diagnosis is not everything. Certainly you want to say that. And the complex PTSD diagnosis isn't even sufficient to address the many forms of complex trauma. Complex trauma is broader, but still to have that diagnosis of CPTSD, which came out as recently as 2018, it's the release of the International Classification of Diseases, the 11th edition, the ICD-11, now has a freestanding complex PTSD diagnosis, and that's been hard fought for by over many years by Judith Herman, among others. So that's something significant in itself. It's not in the DSM, which is probably more used in Australia, but there's a dissociative subtype in the DSM. So really we're moving to increased recognition across the board that trauma is more complex than people realise, and the diagnosis itself testifies to that. Second thing, of course, since 2012 is the Royal Commission. In fact, that was announced, I think I mentioned, but that was really groundbreaking. For that to coincide, Julia Gillard's announcement of that, almost directly with the release of the 2012 guidelines, was game-changing in itself in terms of raising the profile of complex trauma, of Blue Knot as an organisation.
Just to clarify which Royal Commission that was, because we've had a few now. So that was the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse.
Yes, yeah. And that in itself makes the point, doesn't it? This yes. field is so alive with commissions and inquiries, keeping track of them all. But that was a major one, of course, for Blue Knot. The others too, very significant. Yeah. We're experiencing now. So that was another one. Another aspect, and this is the key thing, I guess maybe this is the main thing around the clinical update, is how dynamic the treatment landscape is. So many different approaches, modalities, suggestions, therapies are now available, and in combination with the internet, which is a genie out of the bottle. I mean, like it or not, we are getting online, people are finding out things and looking at treatments and all sorts of things. So we really needed to expand and address the wide range of treatment options that are now available, and try to assess them, to have a look at them. Some of them sort of not traditional in a clinical psychotherapeutic sense, although the language is confusing because what's traditional in one field and what's alternative in one field is not in another. But we've got a whole chapter in the updated guidelines, which will probably be very interesting for people who don't always read, the research, so I just want to go to the guidelines, but looking at things like, energy psychology, EMDR, which of course has been around for a long time, brain spotting, which is a newer sort of modality, hypnotherapy, clinical hypnotherapy, which is very recommended often for dissociation and is less well known. For that reason, we need to raise awareness, and even MDMA assisted psychotherapy. So a number of new approaches. And of course, Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory came out in 2011, just before the 2012 guidelines. But since 2012, there's a lot of polyvagal informed therapies now too. And some of those, that does apply to some of these so-called newer approaches. So really important to address what's going on with treatment. Also, phased treatment, which is recommended for complex trauma, is being looked at again. There's a lot of different views about that. It's still recommended by complex trauma clinicians. But in light of the changed treatment landscape, it's important to ask, can we safely accelerate treatment for complex trauma? There's so many different sort of, body-oriented type approaches, energy psychology, hypnotherapy, that potentially can assist treatment of complex trauma, even in a phased way. So how we integrate some of these newer approaches within phased treatment was another reason to update the guidelines. And of course, a lot more on dissociation, and we'll get to that in a minute because we've got another set of guidelines on that.
So do the 2019 guidelines replace the 2012 guidelines, or how do they sit together? So have some of the things presented in the 2012 guidelines been disproved?
That's a good. I was about to say they do replace, but they certainly don't disprove anything.
Yeah,
I think we'd probably recommend people go straight to the 2019 guidelines now. But just because they're so much more full and more up to date, so much really has happened, as we said, in light of, and one happening I haven't mentioned yet is, of course, the Jenny Haynes verdict, in 2019, just before we released the updated version. Of course, there was a conviction of the father of Jenny Haynes, who egregiously abused her daughter in early childhood. So essentially, we had a judicial validation of the DID diagnosis and its etiology in childhood trauma. So it's important to be aware that a lot has changed since 2012. And if you read the 2012 guidelines, you certainly won't be misled or get anything wrong. The information's there, but it's so much more detailed and up to date in the 2019 ones.
Yeah. And of course, there's a set of complementary guidelines that went alongside the 2019 guidelines. And you often say that they've also been pushed aside a little bit. They're actually quite critical. So would you like to talk to them?
Yeah, sure. Especially wanted to say something about that, because they are complementary in the sense that they're shorter sets, and they do sort of provide another aspect to the clinical ones, but they're not complementary, meaning that they're not significant or that they're optional. In fact, the complementary guidelines are 2 short sets within the same publication. And the first is on how does therapy for complex trauma differ from therapy for other issues and other modalities. And this is really critical, because most of us who work as clinicians know that we've had to substantially learn on the spot and tweak what we've learned. Now, it doesn't mean what we've learned in the range of different counselling courses and therapies that are out there hasn't been helpful, but it does need to be tweaked significantly. Things like, and some standard articles of faith about what good therapy is actually need to be revised a little bit. For example, we talk a lot about the whole person, but as Janina Fisher says, for someone who's severely dissociated and fragmented, if they don't perceive themselves as a whole person, and it's hard for the therapist to perceive as a whole person, and we are really, talking about parts. A lot of therapies talk about using I statements, and I know that was what I'd learned as a student of counselling, very quickly encouraging people to, own their experience and use the I pronoun. But for someone who's fragmented and dissociated, that's very difficult to do. So using I statements would come well down the track. And also relates to resourcing. Often many approaches assume a person can ground pretty quickly. They might say, think of a nice experience you've had. But it's really important for every clinician to know that people with complex trauma do start in a very different place than people who don't. So a lot of the standard things we might suggest and assume need to be substantially tailored. So that's what the first set of guidelines in the complementary set.
And can I ask, what's the risk of not knowing that, not knowing, those different differences that you've just stressed?
I think the risk is very, very high. I mean, I guess at best it would mean inefficient therapy that goes around the mulberry bush for a very long time before there's a clear sense of what's going on for both client and therapist often. And at worst, it would mean active re-traumatization, where a person isn't connecting at all with the approach that's being assumed. So it really is very important. We know for a diagnosis of DID, it can take years for that to be accurately diagnosed. But there's also, as we'll talk about, a range of disorders, quote unquote, and even experiences and conditions that fall short of a clinical diagnosis, but that do relate to dissociation. So it's very important that every clinician knows something about this and how not to just assume that the frameworks they've learned in their college or their university, as general and as benign as they seem to be, can just be transposed into work with complex.
So not necessarily benign at all.
No, not necessarily. I mean, a good example is and a very salutary example for a lot of us is that empathy is certainly not enough. And Peter Levine's talked about this. And most of us as clinicians like to feel we're empathetic people and genuinely do empathise with clients. But for a client who's never received empathy and warmth and is understandably very distrustful of human contact, because therapy is profoundly triggering, of course, it can be very shaming for a client to feel that they can't respond to the empathy of the therapist. So there's actually these are really important, got a number of things where we think we're on the right track and we could actually be actually distressing the client without realising.
So we really should be talking about these guidelines a lot more.
A lot more, absolutely. Yeah. And the second set in the complementary is the competencies for therapists. So it follows well. They're 2 short sets. You know, this is how therapy differs for complex trauma, and these are the competencies ideally you should have. So really, they're quite foundational.
Yeah.
Even prior to the clinical guidelines, the complementary ones, you know, should be really looked at by everybody unless they already know quite a lot about complex trauma stuff.
And they're certainly very accessible as well.
Yeah.
Everyone. You mentioned dissociation, and you know, that brings us to an additional set of guidelines, which obviously, there's been a lot of research which, you know, is not necessarily all that well understood around dissociation and different models.
No, it's still not. And this is another one that's sort of quite challenging, because again, the awareness about the prevalence of trauma and the fight, flight, freeze response, everybody can sort of say that trifecta, fight, flight, freeze, but actually most of us, including clinicians, know much less about the third of those responses. Fight and flight are pretty obvious, you know, fighting back and fleeing, and but freezing, which is linked to the hypo shutdown response. Actually, dissociation is incredibly complex. It's not only shut down. A person may be active in their behaviour but still be dissociated. But in contrast to hyperarousal, which is visible, we can usually see if someone's distressed. With dissociation, it's much less apparent, and it can easily pass, you know, people just pass the awareness of a clinician. So it's really important that we all need to tune into the possibility of it, how to recognise the signs of it. And some of the work on which we draw in the new dissociation guidelines makes the point. This came out in 2017, this book, but not much has changed in some ways, that most clinicians don't know how to recognise dissociation. They haven't been trained to, they don't know how to assess for it. So that's why we have this second set, as we're saying. So we've got a chapter on dissociation in the Clinical Updated, which is a basic, why is dissociation important? That's important to read. But there's so much around dissociation. It's important now that we've released a second set specifically dedicated to dissociation in its various forms, how to recognise it, how to work with it, and so on.
And what's the best way to understand dissociation? Because it's not always related to trauma, is it?
Yeah, no, that not at all. So I think myself, the continuum model is very helpful. There are people who disagree with it, and we can understand that there's always different views on everything. But if we see, you know, a continuum model, which we use for many forms of psychological issues and disorders, are relatively mild at one end and more severe at the other end, we can start to see how dissociation can take many forms. And in fact, dissociation is simply at a basic level just not being present, just tuning out. And when we look at it like that, we can see how it can be very benign and normal and everyday, because we all do that for all sorts of reasons all the time, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, if we have to use that response regularly to protect ourselves, as in the case of childhood trauma, if the need to dissociate and shut down and not notice is frequent and has to be activated all the time, it becomes primarily protective and defensive, and it can become the way the mind organises. So people automatically dissociate in a more severe way that impedes quality of life. So we could have at one level mild dissociation like daydreaming, highway hypnosis, all sorts of minor forms at one end of the continuum, right the way up to DID at the other. So that's probably a helpful way to explain it, but it also shows how complex it is. So that's why we wanted a separate publication to sort of address some of that.
Why do you think the sector has struggled so much around dissociation, around accepting it? Because, you know, certainly the research shows, you know, how fundamental it really is to us as human beings. And yet there's still quite a split in the psychological counselling community around it.
Yes, yeah. I think there's a number of reasons for that. And one of them, I think, is that in our sort of Western culture, in a way, we've been reluctant to sort of draw attention to something when we're not sure. I mean, often when we speak to someone, when we tune in, we really do realise that somebody's hesitated for quite a long time or looked away where we didn't expect them to, and we've kind of dismissed it as, oh, that's just normal. And it could be just normal. But I think our desire to sort of not address something until we're absolutely sure has meant that we've clinicians as well have let a lot go. So there's that. We're not used to sort of raising something. And that's another issue with where therapy is different. I learned as a student, the client always leads. The therapist shouldn't be proactive. It'll come from the client. Of course, with dissociation, if the person doesn't know they're dissociating, or even if they know but they're embarrassed about it, which is very common too, they're not going to mention it. So it goes back to the previous question. We're sitting there thinking we're connecting well with the client, and this important aspect isn't even noted at all. So that's one. A second one, though, and perhaps more significant, is we are very reluctant as a human species, I think, and understandably, to countenance really egregious violations of other people, especially when they relate to children. And now DID is the most severe form. There's many forms of dissociation, including severe, that don't take the form of DID. But certainly if somebody has to defend by dissociating protectively frequently, it's usually for a very good reason and a very disturbing reason. And there's such a thing as cultural dissociation too. We see it in denial of war, not wanting to face up to recompensing where there's been injustice. So I think there's a very human desire not to want to make those connections, to kind of pretend they're not there even when they are. So there's that aspect as well.
And so what hope and help is there for people experiencing trauma-related dissociation and who do live with DID?
Yeah, there's so much more now, and that's why we wanted to release the guidelines. It seemed to be initially something, maybe it's important, but what do we do about it? But there is so much we can do and so much we need to know. And an example of that would be mindfulness. Now, mindfulness has become such a common approach, and it's a good approach. Mindfulness is important, but it's not something people who are dissociated can readily do. One of the clinicians we draw on, Christine Fauna, who's written a book on mindfulness with dissociation. So that's important for people to know about. This could be where people are unwittingly traumatized by clinicians who are encouraging the client to be mindful, but mindfulness is in opposition to dissociation, because mindfulness is about focused attention. Yeah. Dissociation is about losing attention, not being able to pay attention. So you've got a contradiction between the two, and the dissociation will always win with trauma. People can't concentrate if they're distressed. So even just knowing that some of the approaches that are there have to be worked up to. They can't be assumed. There's different ways we can help people to notice. Needs to be taken slowly. They need to be resourced. There's a lot of different ideas and suggestions for working with dissociation that we've tried to include in the guidelines, and just break down that silence and not knowing that's existed for too long and still does exist, really.
The Blue Knot Day 2020 is about hope and possibilities for healing. So there are real possibilities for healing for people with dissociation.
Absolutely. And Marlene Steinberg's a clinician who said that the fact that even severe, dissociation and fragmentation of the personality can be recovered from is a sign of hope and healing for all of us. She says that. So that's the other good thing. We know so much more from the neuroscience, from clinical reports and so on, that far more recovery is possible than was thought back in, the late.
Yeah, very, very critical for people listening to know that.
Absolutely.
So as we talk, we seem to have a lot of guidelines, a lot of publications, but I just want to quickly flag the ones for supervisors of complex trauma therapists.
Yes, yeah. There's one other one to mention too before we sign off. Yeah, the supervisors is a very important one, because many people who are supervisors, of course, are already well qualified and already experienced, and they may have seen a lot of therapists and supervisors who've dealt with trauma, but they may not themselves be up with the latest on trauma research, because a lot of it has come out, let's face it, in the last 10 to 15 years, validating the more recent stuff. So it's really important that supervisors don't think, I already know this, just because I've been in the field for a long time. Yes, you're very qualified in your field, but really, if you haven't looked at some of the more recent stuff, you may be surprised, as we said, in light of not assuming that certain approaches will work very well, by how much the field's changed. So there's a separate set of guidelines for supervisors that will really help both with their own knowledge and working with the clinicians they supervise.
Yeah. And I think we have one more that we are flagging, which is upcoming. Have we covered all the others that we've already published? It's
Oh, well, I just wanted to mention briefly, they're not guidelines as such, but a very important and accessible paper also online at the Blue Knight website is the paper on memory.
Yeah.
That's because, again, this is how much has changed, how much has moved with the research. There's so much on memory now that we've obviously put some of that into the clinical update, but that too merited more detailed discussion than could be accommodated easily. So we've got a paper called The Truth of Memory and the Memory of Truth. Different types of memory and the significance for trauma. This is so important because a lot of people in the PSY professions, and this is a point that Peter Levine makes, very credentialed in his field, many people in the PSY profession still don't really understand the distinctions between explicit and implicit memory. In other words, conscious and non-conscious. We know, there's such a thing as an unconscious. Most people recognise that. But when we talk about memory, we tend to assume it's the autobiographical, narrative, verbal, conscious form of memory, rather than the subcortical forms, which is what traumatic memory relates to. So it's not all that complicated. I mean, it can be complicated, but we've broken it down into the key points about the differences between explicit and implicit memory and the significance for trauma. And that's in that separate paper on the truth of memory that people can download from the website as well.
Of course, that's obviously critical for people with lived experience, but also for health professionals in the legal and justice system as well. Issues of memory are obviously prominent.
Yeah, absolutely. And also too, the trauma informed that we're about to get to for the legals as well. I mean, often if somebody appears to be a bit disorganised in their presentation, obviously it's quite challenging to present in a court anyway. People can look unreliable, they can look as if they're not together and so on, because they're not presenting coherently. So important that legal people understand, as they're starting to, and Blue Knight's done some work with legals, the impacts of trauma on the brain and body, and how somebody may appear to be very disorganised in their presentation, but it is not at all necessarily a sign that of their veracity or
exactly. And of course, we did publish a small paper for the legal and justice sector as well. Around some trauma-informed legal processes.
Yeah.
So the upcoming publication. No
wonder.
Is
everybody still with us?
Yes, I think it's fantastic to reflect, and but as we talk about all the different publications, they really are very significant. So just wanted to thank you for your incredible research and contribution to not just Blue Knot and survivors, but to the field overall.
Well, it's been very gratifying to know that we're living at a time where we can make this information accessible to people. That's the exciting thing, isn't it? So, and I guess we'd say to people, if you're not getting a sense of hope and optimism in the treatment you're receiving, you really, really should be. That that's validated by the research that so much is possible in terms of recovery.
Exactly.
But the final set upcoming is, as we said before, releasing as a separate set the organisational trauma-informed guidelines. So we're separating out the clinical, which are the updated 2019. These are the non-clinical organisational, how services, mental health, and more broadly in society can and should organise to treat people in a humane way. So trauma-informed basically says that we know trauma is so prevalent, even if we don't know whether the people we come in contact with have it, and the chances are they could have, and they may not say it, they may not know it. So therefore our organisations need to be set up in such a way to be reassuring, to assist with trust and so on. So trauma-informed organisations is about, setting up organisations that treat people humanely, know about the impacts of trauma on the brain and body, just know how not to make things worse, really. It's as simple as that. But that is top to bottom. It's every aspect of the organisation, from policies and procedures to, even to volunteers, people in casual positions, anybody who's in contact with anybody, which of course they are in various capacities, needs to know how to relate to and carry out their position in a way that doesn't make things worse for people. They need to be trauma informed.
And similarly to the clinical space, there's been a lot of progress since 2012, since the original trauma informed guidelines. And I know these guidelines will include some cases where implementation has proceeded and just looks at the outcomes of that.
Yeah, and there was a book that came out at the end of 2019, I think, wasn't it, called Humanising Mental Health Care in Australia. So psychiatrist Richard Benjamin in Tasmania and Joan Halliburn, a psychiatrist in Sydney, and Serena King, a psychologist, have co-edited the first trauma-informed textbook that we draw on in our upcoming guidelines, and it just charts some of how far we've come since, in the last decade in organisations moving towards becoming trauma-informed in Australia. Yeah,
and you and I were both honoured to write chapters, for that particular publication. So.
Yeah. So it's great. And again, that shows why we needed to do this update, because all this has happened since 2012. Yeah.